Well, good afternoon, ladies. Perhaps I could begin by saying how very welcome you are, your presence in this committee. It's not judicial, if I can put it that way, but it is, I think, important to get an industrial and business handle on what is happening. If I could just divert for one moment, which I wouldn't normally do if it weren't for a specific event of today. In doing so, I think I should, as it were, declare my personal interest as a father of 3 daughters, and indeed as the grandfather of 3 granddaughters now. And I think it is worth remarking on the fact that on a day when Parliament Square has been graced by the statue of Millicent Fawcett, we have a representation with which I have personally absolutely no reservations. We're delighted to see you here, from senior industrial figures, all of which is female, and that seems to me something that I would not have even thought could ever have been possible at the beginning of my interest in political life 50 years ago, but something very much to be commended and welcomed, not least because of the character of the 3 persons involved. It enables me to go on from that, to say that the committee is obviously meeting to consider the implications for what may happen in relation, whereas 50 years ago, when I started in this sort of trade in a different capacity, we were looking at the implications of the UK joining the then EEC. We are now looking at the implications of the UK leaving the European Union. And whatever view one may take of that, it's a complicated issue, and we wanted to get an industrial handle on it, or an industry and commercial handle on it, as well as a purely political and diplomatic handle. Although I wouldn't like the witnesses to feel in any way inhibited, not least because I know of some of your very strong personal interest and involvement in adverting to some of the political issues, for example, the Irish border, which has been of considerable concern to this committee. But we need, I think, to emphasise there are real issues from the decisions which are currently being implemented in terms of wages, jobs, pensions, investment, and future economic growth. And I'm sure your delegation will illuminate our thoughts on that as we feel a way towards an outcome. Now, one of the exigencies which is to some extent determined by IT of this room is that it's at some distance, so if we can all try and communicate in a lively way, I'm sure we will, and I hope you can project and we can respond accordingly. But initially I think it might be sensible if you were each, as you feel most comfortable in whichever order of batting you like, to identify yourselves. For the record, this is of course a public session. I should have made that clear if it wasn't. And to say briefly how your positions, severally CBI, TUC, City of London Corporation, are in relation to Brexit, what your priorities are, and how your organisation's positions have evolved since the referendum decision, which is now some time ago. Who'd like to go first? Francis.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for the invitation. My name is Frances O'Grady. I'm the General Secretary of the TUC. We represent nearly 6 million working people in every part of the UK in 49 unions. We're also a member of the ETUC, the body representing union centres across Europe, and will continue to stay in membership of the ETUC. As many of you will know, the TUC, after considerable deliberation, and I wouldn't want to pretend it was an easy decision, but we campaigned for a Remain vote. We know that we tracked it. We shifted our trade unionists' point of view with, on the day itself, 60% of trade unionists voting for Remain. We know that a majority of working people workers voted Remain too, but immediately when the result came through, we accepted it and put a strong argument, I think, right at the start, that we would like to see a Team UK approach to bring the country back together and find a consensus and a way forward. We also argued early on for a transition agreement because we could see as practical negotiators that this was not going to be sewn up in a hurry. Our key priorities are around protecting jobs, including those jobs that rely on trade with the EU. Livelihoods, we're concerned about what will happen to wages and indeed prices, and also for a level playing field on workers' rights. That means not just protecting rights, but keeping pace with that safety net into the future. And Michael Ford QC did a very good assessment of the issues there for us, which of course we'd be happy to share. You may have seen this morning that the CBI and TUC also wrote jointly to the Times on another key concern for us, which is avoidance of a hard border in Ireland and the protection of the Good Friday Agreement. And from the perspective of trade unions and civic society more broadly, many of you will know that a lot of work went up into the lead up to that agreement and into sustaining it ever since. And as practical people, we're conscious of the importance of protecting good jobs in that respect too. Just finally, we have if you like, a helicopter view of the negotiating table. And on both sides, we give that same message about jobs and rights and livelihoods. We have carried out our own, as I would see it, hard-headed assessment of the options for a future relationship and indeed the alternatives if we were to crash out with no deal. And it is our view that we would like to stick with the customs union and indeed the single market as the best way of protecting working people. As we say, if anybody's got a better idea, we're all ears. But for now, that's our position. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to go next, Carolyn?
I will go next. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me here today. A real pleasure. I'm Carolyn Fairbairn. I'm Director General of the CBI. We speak for 190,000 businesses in all parts of the country, of all sizes, right up from start-up through to multinational. We represent the work, so 7 million people employed in those businesses, about a third of the private sector workforce. And we take incredibly seriously our role to reflect those different voices with as much evidence and measured analysis as we can. If I wind the clock back to when I first joined the CBI and the referendum was called, we too took a position based on the evidence that we had from our members, which was the majority wanted to remain. We polled them. We were extremely careful about our governance, and 85% of our members were very clear that they wanted to remain, and 5% wanted to leave. On the basis of that, we took a position. We were very clear, though, it was about the economics and that there were other considerations, and we were not telling people how to vote. And indeed, the day after the referendum, almost immediately, the voice of our members was saying that they wanted, our mandate from our members was they wanted now to turn to making this successful. They accepted the result, and it is now about making it successful. And we identified back at that period 4 principles, 4 objectives that we had, and although they have evolved, actually I think at root they are still fundamentally the same. At the top, in terms of the top priority, is barrier-free trade. I think the reason that our members were so in favour of remaining is that the value of that single market and customs union membership enabled access to 500 million consumers, supported supply chains across Europe. So barrier-free trade, and that means no border delays or controls, tariff-free, regulatory alignment where possible, and access to the people and talent needed for growth. Those were the principles we established at the beginning. How has that evolved? Well, we have continued, as you would imagine, to talk to our members constantly. We've had thousands upon thousands of conversations, and I think a number of things have become even clearer to us. I think the massive complexity of what we have embarked on and the time it will take for business to adapt. So, like Francis, we very early on called for a transition period. And I think actually the joint voice of the TUC and the CBI on that, and indeed with the corporation, was very powerful and has been real progress. I think other points that we have learned. We have learned that the uncertainty has really genuinely damaged our economy already. We surveyed our members in October last year, and 40% told us that they had delayed or postponed investment decisions. And although the economy is ticking along nicely, we say, in our words, we're at a trot and the rest of the world is at a gallop. You know, we could be doing much better, and you are seeing that in the business investment figures that we are seeing now. So the effect of Brexit uncertainty is real now and very apparent. And then I think the third area, in a sense of lessons learned along the way and evolution, is just that hugely important issue of the Irish border. Now, we did talk about it and try and understand it in the run-up to the referendum, but gosh, I mean, the understanding, I think, has escalated, and the connection between the Good Friday Agreement, peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland has become clearer to all of us. I'm in Belfast on Thursday with our members. I'm speaking at a dinner for 600 businesses, and this is number one on their minds, and I think it is hugely important that we solve it. Just finally then, on priorities now and our position now based on that evolution, I think that there are three. The first is around that border issue. We have taken a clear position on customs and the importance of retaining a customs union possibility on the table. As Francis has said, we also are all ears. If there is a better solution to the Northern Ireland border, then we would like to hear it, but it's not just about that. When I'm in the Midlands, I hear about our SME members who export to Europe. There are 150,000 businesses in the UK who only export to the European Union. They have no ability to create systems to be able to deal with border control. So we are very clear in our position on customs. Second, on regulatory alignment, we produced a big report, major report last week, which you may, I hope, possibly have seen, called Smooth Operations. We've analysed 23 sectors. We have asked the question, which regulations really matter for 23 sectors? And the answer is there are opportunities for divergence from EU regulation, but they are modest compared with the costs of divergence. And from that, I think we are taking, again, a position that regulatory alignment is going to be vital. And then the final issue for us that is absolutely central is the issue of people and the future migration model. It is often the first thing that businesses, that CEOs raise with me when I go and see them. The climate that we are creating, the uncertainty around the future, and the huge importance for our global brand as well as our domestic business environment of having, yes, a controlled migration model, but an open migration model for the future. Thank you.
Catherine.
And thank you also for inviting me. And indeed, for that introduction, I think it was important to raise the point that we are all women speaking here today. Important, I think, because there's so much more work to be done. Let me just flag that up. It is good that there are the three of us.
Personally,
there are more. I chair the policy committee in the City of London Corporation. That means I'm effectively the political leader of the elected body which both looks after the square mile itself, and we are the local authority effectively for the square mile, but also has a very close relationship with the financial and professional services sector which carries our name, the City, although of course it is a UK-wide sector which involves 2.2 million direct jobs, about 74 billion of tax a year, and people working directly in it. In Belfast, for example, there's a strong cluster, so it's a UK-wide asset export sector, and John Glenn described it just yesterday as the fuel for the economy.
You could also say it was a European asset.
We could indeed, and indeed that's a very important point. The financial and related professional services sector with which we work is a global sector serving global clients, including European customers and businesses. And I think that's very important as we look at what would work for the sector. We're not asking for something for the UK, we're asking for something which will work for a global sector to enable it to carry on operating optimally. We took an unusual position for an organisation which is normally fairly non-political before the referendum, in that we actually actively supported Remain. We took a decision to support Remain. And we did that because our stakeholders, those businesses that we work with, told us so consistently that would be the best outcome, and that was what they wanted. But once the referendum once the referendum was decided, we have since then been working pragmatically with the sector to try to identify what the issues are for them in this tremendously complex situation, what the best solutions would be to enable that global sector to carry on working best, and then to advocate those both here and with EU27 and indeed wider afield. Because this being a global sector, what we decide for it will have impacts in other countries beyond the EU's borders. It is an immensely complicated area. We could talk in detail about specifics, but I'm going to talk about the three core pillars which the sector has been asking for, and I call those the three T's. And those are around transition, where we all felt that transition was important for a number of reasons. First, to avoid people making suboptimal decisions before the ultimate arrangement was clear. But secondly, because it is going to take time to move carefully through this process, wherever we're going to. There's going to be a lot of plumbing to do in terms of documents that need to be redrawn, arrangements that need to be altered. I think we all can reflect in these last few months on what we've all had to face in our own personal inboxes with GDPR and having to click on consents and so on all the time to keep your emails flowing. And then put yourself in the position of a business receiving from its insurers, from its banks, from its investment advisors, whoever else it's dealing with on this front, multiple requests to make even small changes to arrangements to reflect whatever new arrangements have to be done. It is going to be complicated. Transition, a trading arrangement which allows the best possible mutual access to markets so that the sector that's based here can continue serving European customers, but equally institutions based in Europe can continue operating here. There we have worked a considerable amount of work has been done. The sector has come together in a way which I think is unprecedented, and we have been working with the various trade associations and cross-sectoral bodies. And the solution which seems to us the best one is an arrangement in an ambitious free trade agreement allowing for mutual market access on the basis of mutual recognition of regulatory outcomes. That's a solution that's been put forward in particular by IRSG, a group of global practitioners which the City of London Corporation and City UK support. I should, in the interest of clarity, say that I am a deputy chairman both of City UK and of the IRSG, but that's ex officio because of my position. But that is what we're looking for, an ambitious trading agreement that will allow markets to carry on operating across borders, and we feel that that would be in the interests of EU27 as well as the UK. And then I think a final T, which is the question of talent, of people. In order to serve a global sector, we have the city has drawn very heavily on a global talent pool. More than 41% of the workers in the city itself were born outside the UK. The wonderful diversity that we have in London and indeed in the other parts of the sector across the UK have helped it to service to understand the needs of its global customers and to service them. And so it is essential, we feel, that for the future there is an immigration policy which allows firms to recruit, retain and move the people that they need, while at the same time So we need an immigration policy which will allow that, which is easy to operate so that people don't have to spend ages filling in forms and find impediments to getting the consents that they need to come, while at the same time, of course, supporting local workforce as part of the jobs that we can offer. So the 3 T's, talent, trade and transition. We don't take a position on the customs union because, frankly, it isn't directly applicable to us and those asks in this sector's case. We have been very pragmatic and are trying to operate within the red lines that have been put down, so we're not asking for membership of the single market, although that would also give us what we're looking for. We're trying to operate with the red lines which there are. And we don't take a position on the Northern Irish border because we probably don't have a locus to comment on that, but I would just say that today is also the 25th anniversary of the Bishopsgate bomb, which was a direct action by the IRA trying to disrupt the city. Indeed, I'm going straight from here to a commemorative event, and I think it's important to remember just how far we've come and what progress we've made and how important it is to safeguard that.
Well, thank you very much for those introductions, which are very helpful in setting the scene. And I hope, as it were, to retire to allow the committee to ask you further. We have, I think, functionally about an hour, if that's convenient for everyone, given their schedules. Without being invidious at all, can I particularly thank Catherine for reminding us that there are real-world consequences for the position in or potential in the island of Ireland, which I know she is aware for other reasons, and that's a matter of considerable continuing concern to this committee, as it has been to those in your initial statements. I think we'll go straight on to Lord Jay.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Chairman. Welcome. It's good to see you again. You all spoke in different ways about the importance of, if we are going to leave, making leave succeed or making leave successful. I mean, some would argue that the government's position on how we're going to do that has not always been crystal clear. But I wonder whether you'd like to say something about the how far you found the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, which did set up an agenda for the future as being coherent and convincing.
Thank you for that question. I'm happy to go first on that one. It was a real step forward, I have to say. I think that the challenge I think we had up until that point was the sense that you could have everything, and that this kind of core central question, which is the trade-off between access and control, was somehow not there, and that it was possible to cake and eat it was kind of it was the phrase of the moment. And I think, in terms of the business community, we just know, and we knew that wasn't going to be possible. So the real steps forward were, for example, the recognition that membership of agencies would be potentially valuable, something that we still think is incredibly important to be seeking to get. The fact that frictionless trade is a real ambition but that not everybody will get that things won't be as good as they are now. It was actually very helpful to hear that, because then you are in the world of trade-offs. And that the ECJ would continue to have potentially a minor role. It has been such a red line. So this all felt very positive. If there is still, I think, a concern, and it remains a serious one, is if Mansion House was more about the what. It set out the what and the vision. It did not say enough about the how. And I, without taking everything back to customs, I certainly don't want to do that. I think that is, in a sense, almost a fulcrum issue, because the aspiration for frictionless trade across borders is absolutely, I think we all share it, but there aren't a million ways to achieve it. And the sort of the how around the Irish border, the how around, is where we would like to see the position evolve to. So, big step forward, but more work to do.
Thank you.
And for our part, we very much welcomed the Mansion House speech and indeed the Chancellor's speech shortly afterwards. It was a very positive step forward, because we had been waiting for some time, and I would say too long actually, for clarity on the ask from from this country. Particularly welcome the position taken over services and the inclusion of services in the agreement, which we believe is absolutely essential, that services and financial services should be covered in whatever deal we do. What I think we need to do now is move on from speeches which Europe, EU27, tell us they don't recognise as being a sort of negotiating proper negotiating ask, to more detail and clarity. Of course, that may be happening behind the scenes and we may not know about it. The message until those speeches that we were getting consistently in our journeys around EU27, where we and the rest of the sector are going, was tell us what you want, tell us what you want. We need to know what is it you're asking for. That has, they do now know in headline terms, but they're still asking us for greater clarity and greater detail, and that's something which I think we all need.
I think back at Congress House there was probably slightly less enthusiasm expressed for the speech, although I would agree very much that what I thought was really significant was that this was the first time that the Prime Minister acknowledged or warned that we would not get the exact same benefits. And I thought that was a very important acknowledgement. From our perspective, that has real-life consequences for jobs, and people still felt very much in the dark about, well, what benefits are we going to be worse off in respect of. I thought it was also welcome, as I recall in that speech, that the Prime Minister also ruled out a hard border in Ireland. And if I remember rightly, that included ruling out physical infrastructure. I think that's important to remember, certainly when we get on to discussing possible solutions and smart borders and so on. But I think perhaps the lower degree of enthusiasm was in respect of what we saw as essentially still a wish list. Like everybody else, we're in close contact with our European counterparts. We meet heads of state around the E27. We were very clear, and think that the Commission had made it very clear to the UK that there was going to be no cherry picking, in which case that list didn't look as if it would sit very easily alongside what the EU had said. And finally, I would say that we believed that there was a missed opportunity on the part of the PM. There are times in negotiations, and I'm not pretending it's exactly the same, but certainly in industrial negotiations, there are times when you make a gesture, when you extend an olive branch in practical terms to try and unlock negotiations. And I thought that this was a time when the Prime Minister could have responded positively to Monsieur Barnier by offering a level playing field on workers' rights. Everybody has said they don't want to see a race to the bottom. Here was a chance to say in concrete terms, and we're going to prove it. We'll find a way to guarantee that there will be a safety net between us, and we won't be competing on the back of unfair competition by worsening workers' rights. That would have been an offer, if you like, that I think could have created that different tone and atmospherics around the negotiations.
No social jumping, I think, is the phrase that people tend to use in Europe, isn't it? Michael.
Thank you very much. Well, just one follow-up question. You've all sort of said, I think, that you would regard that speech, in fact, as a move forward, but not enough. And Catherine McGuinness talked about the need for greater clarity in what the government wants to achieve. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, a little bit more what I think in the jargon is known as granularity about what the government might now be aiming for and what it should say it is aiming for, and what we need to know what it is aiming for. Some of that has come out in the answers to, for example, which Francis O'Grady said just now, but I wondered if you'd all like to say a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So, in no particular order, For example, we've talked about where we would want to be and value being members of agencies. I know from my conversations, I was in Berlin on Friday, and the question was, well, which ones and why? And what's the mutual benefit? So I think that's one of the things that we could do, and set that out very clearly. I think that it would be very useful to be much clearer about regulatory alignment. So again, the speech had examples. And in fact, it was quite detailed. It had mentioned car parts. It had some examples, but it wasn't comprehensive. And we do think that there's an opportunity to be comprehensive. It's one of the reasons we produced our report on 23 sectors, to go back and again say, actually, I think to Francis's point also, that we want to remain aligned in the majority of areas. The evidence base for that is incredibly powerful. So I think I have that as a second area. I think another area where clarity would be hugely welcomed and help to move things forward would be around our ambitions for the movement of people in future. That feels as though it is really stalled, and it's a problem in the here and now. It's also a challenge that we're having from our European business colleagues across Europe. What does the UK want? How closed, how open are they going to be? So I would just pick those three as important areas, added to, of course, some clarity around what is the solution on the Irish border. That has to be, I think, part of what we go back with in terms of clarity.
If I may just pick up on one point you've taken up, the question of movement. Have you any specific evidence or indication at the moment as to whether people from EU 27 countries are increasingly reluctant to come to the UK because they're uncertain of their continuing rights and regime? And that can be both at the executive level or, as it were, at the working level. And perhaps others would like to join in on that one as well.
Well, if I was categorically, yes. It's a combination of factors. The exchange, let's be honest, exchange rate plays quite a big role, particularly at the non-graduate end. We don't like to talk about unskilled, actually, because everyone has skills. But at the non-graduate end of the market, the potential to send money home is hugely important. There is something very important about the fact that we have not been clear about rights during the transition. That is getting clearer, but even in the event of no deal, that is still not clear. And so we are hearing from members all across the country that they are... I was with a yoghurt manufacturer in Somerset who has been employing almost entirely fantastic Romanian and Polish workers, and he can't... They went home after the summer and they didn't come back. Yeah. At the high end, Catherine will be able to talk to that, I think, very, very clearly. But it's just become that much harder when people have the choice of London or Paris or New York or Tokyo. It's become that much harder. So again, it's a present challenge in the here and now.
Absolutely, that is what we're hearing, and I can't give you precise figures, but I can say that I have spoken to recruitment consultants who tell me that this is what they're experiencing, but also hearing from our businesses that it's not just, in fact, EU workers, because others are also feeling somewhat unwelcome, but the people who might previously have wanted to make their lives here are, when they're thinking of lifetime decisions, are applying for jobs elsewhere, are either not applying to come here in the same numbers that they were, or applying for moves elsewhere. And we're hearing this not just from the banks, and in some ways, you can always get somebody to come for a couple of years because London is such an exciting place and work here, but the pressures are for people who might stay here for longer. But what is also very worrying is that we're hearing it from the tech sector, that the entrepreneurs are becoming very concerned and are not coming or are not staying, and indeed are experiencing, I mentioned earlier, the problems with having to apply for visas or whatever, if that process is difficult. We're also hearing that very clearly, that people are getting very fed up with that and then ringing home and saying, I thought it was great coming to London, actually it's such a bore getting the visa. So we're hearing from a number of different sources concerns that people are less keen to come and stay here and work here.
I'd be happy to put in a supplementary note, but there are hard examples, particularly in our public services, and we're seeing the stress that they're suffering as a result. We know that the number of EU citizens as nurses registering has dropped significantly, midwives too, I believe, but we can provide more information. But I would also add to that we're also getting information from our unions, on a regular basis of incidents where EU citizens, particularly in public-facing roles, for example, on the railways, being asked, when are you going to go home? Thinking, do they mean when am I knocking off? Actually, they mean when are you going home? And I would also just add, I think some of the publicity around what's happened to the Windrush generation does not help in terms of sending out a message about whether Britain is welcoming to migrants from any quarter. And I think we need to take it very seriously. I don't know whether we're going back to that question on the Mansion House.
If you and Catherine McGuinness could say a little bit more about what greater clarity you, we could hope for from the government.
I mean, again, I don't want to simplify this too much, but in the interest of brevity, it seems to me very clear that the EC's guidelines are very clear, that if you rule out single market and customs union membership, what you're left with is Canada, no pluses. It seems to me that the Prime Minister made a big again, as a negotiator, made a strategic mistake. It's fine having red lines, but you don't publish them. You give yourself some room for manoeuvre. You don't tie yourself up so early on in the process. And I think what I would like to hear is some clarity about what the real priorities are for the people of this country. And clearly we're arguing those priorities, the bottom line should be jobs and rights. That's what matters to people. Politically, clearly the Prime Minister has a challenge. I think she has to reach over the heads of her hardliners in her own cabinet and appeal to the country, because I think the country needs to be prepared for those pragmatic trades and compromises that will need to be made. And finally, I would say that she needs to be clear about tackling the root causes of people's concerns, because certainly immigration was a big debate. We can't pretend it wasn't. But the more I've gone around the country, and in the last couple of weeks I've been to Birmingham, Newcastle, Barnsley, the Northeast, talking to people about immigration, people believe that people should be paid the rate for the job wherever they come from, and that employers shouldn't be allowed to undercut. And if we could tackle that and some of the pressure on our schools and hospitals, I think we could have a very different debate.
Thank you.
Come back quickly, and then Lord Little.
I'll come back very, very, very quickly. I was enlightening 2 points. I was enlightening the messages that we're getting back from EU27, where we're still being told that they need more detail. That may be happening, as I say, behind closed doors now. I don't know. But they were saying to us that speeches are great, but that's not what we understand. We need to see hard and fast proposals. But I was also enlightening the question that the sector needs more clarity on what exactly is being asked for. We believe from the Chancellor's speech in particular, and from conversations that we've had, that what we are looking for is indeed what we've been advocating, but it would be helpful to have clarity around that and confirmation that we are looking for an agreement which will cover services as well as goods, that we're looking for an agreement which isn't going to be based on one of the existing models of equivalence, which just would not work, and I can explain why. But I think the big issue at the moment that we really need clarity on, and soon, is what the future immigration policy will be. I think that's becoming very urgent.
Lord Little.
Well, on this point, I'd like to ask another question, because you've been very clear about the uncertainties that have been created on migration in the short term. The question is, what are your recommendations to the government for their long-term migration policy post-Brexit? I mean, in the referendum, there was a kind of received wisdom, I think, on the Brexit side, and obviously I wasn't on the Brexit side, so I hope I'm not misinterpreting them, that that, yes, we would welcome high-skilled migration post-Brexit, but that there was an opportunity to cut back numbers very considerably of low-skilled migrants to this country. Now, is that the business view, that that should be the objective or not?
Yes and no. We certainly do need high-skilled labour, but we need non-graduate labour as well. And I think one of the things that I think was a concern at the very beginning was that there was this idea that that's the only problem. And actually that is a tempting route to go down, because I think all of the polling research shows that's a very easy public argument, that at the very high school. But actually what's very interesting is if you look underneath, Ipsos Mori do some fantastic polling here, and if you ask people about specific skill sets and specific needs categories, if you ask them about construction workers, yeah, of course we need them. Care workers, of course we need them. People to come and pick our fruit, of course we need them. And it's a much more subtle debate than just high-skilled versus low-skilled. So we do resist. Business does resist that simple bifurcation between the two. And I think one of the really simple recommendations we have for the future would be drop the migration cap, drop the migration target. This creates a numbers-based policy rather than a needs-based policy. And if we did work bottom up, we do need to have controls. I think our businesses recognise that. But the idea that we would have an arbitrary number, which is creating all sorts of distortions. I mean, we have hit the visa cap for non-EU people coming to our country in every month in the last 4. We are saying that we can't have engineers come into this country. And the reason for that, we've got fewer nurses coming from the European Union, so more are coming from outside, and they're using up all of the visas. That is madness for our economy. So we need to be talking about all skill levels. The idea of moving away from a net migration target, I think, is very, very important. And we want to work very constructively with the government in terms of a new model, because I think we know it has to change.
But Carolyn, can I just press you? Is it the CBI's view that it does not make economic sense from the point of view of British business to go for a big cut in low-skill migration into this country?
Categorically, yes.
Categorically.
If I look at where we are trying to go as a country, we are trying to build 250,000 houses a year. We are trying to grow our economy into the tech space where we need all sorts of different skills. This needs to be tied into the industrial strategy and what we are trying to be and become. And it is our job, I think, to build that evidence base. So a dramatic cut in migration to this country would, I think, look at the skill shortages we have now, undoubtedly hit our economy. And we can, again, furnish more evidence behind that.
To add a word from your perspective on this, I'm conscious of the time because it's
I'm fascinated by the way the debate has moved from one of being about cutting migration to now controlling migration. And I think in terms of some of the people I speak to, if we're going to talk about controls, then we will need to convince them that there will be controls on those bad employers who use migrant workers to worsen wages and conditions. And we've seen it in Sports Direct and all sorts of places where that happens. Now we know certainly the TUC, well, it's 3 million workers now on 0 hours contracts, agency and other insecure contracts. And people rightly feel worried about that. But that's where our action should be focused. For the TUC's perspective, we've always advocated a fair migration system. We don't see workers as the problem, we see exploitation as the problem.
Thank you. I'm only going to put down a slight note, if you can forgive me, Baroness Faulkner. I think we need to move on a bit now, and you can get your points, I'm sure, in a moment, because I simply don't want to run out of time in terms of managing the overall agenda. I think Lord Whitty next.
Well, you've all touched on this in parts, but I'd like to get more clearly your take on the position of the other side of the negotiating table. What do you think of the EU's position as set out in the Council guidelines and indeed the Parliament guidelines? And how realistic is that? And also, in doing so, could you perhaps touch on the views of your counterparts in Europe and what pressure or otherwise they may be bringing on the negotiations?
Well, perhaps I could start with that one, since I introduced Commissioner Dombrovskis this morning at the Guildhall to the audience, where he gave a rather trenchant speech, making rather clear his views that, so far as the asks, and let me just remind you, our asks for the sector around transition, trade and talent, he was speaking in particular on our asks around trade. Obliquely, he was saying that for the sector, the only show in town effectively is equivalence, though he did then admit that equivalence, he did concede that equivalence in itself has defects. But that this was what he said this was what the UK would need to be looking for. We dispute that. We feel that it is in the interests of the EU 27 as well as the UK to reach an agreement on financial services, which reflects the fact that this is a global sector serving, as I said before, serving customers across border. There are many examples where the EU has accepted financial services in agreements. So I think we can look at Canada, although we need to do more with that. One could look at South Korea and Japan. One can look at the proposals that the EU themselves came up with on TTIP. So it's not the case that there is only one model that they will stick to, but that is the message that we got, I think, from the speech this morning. And so that we have work to do. We have work to do to persuade them otherwise. And that's what we will be trying to do.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Our network across Europe is called Business Europe. There are CBI equivalents in the EU 27, and we've been working extensively with them. I think we have seen all of them in the last 3 months. I was in Berlin on Friday. I'll be in Paris in a couple of weeks' time. I think I'd say a couple of positives about where we are and a couple of real challenges. I mean, I think the real positives are that business across the European Union is very aligned in terms of wanting to protect as many of the benefits as we have now. And for example, there was a united business voice around transition, which was very powerful. And so I think that is a good thing. There isn't a kind of attitude of punishment. It really doesn't. I don't hear it in any conversations that I have. And for example, they are very pro regulatory alignment and trying to find some kind of solution on customs. Where I think that we have a real challenge is, and I hear it amongst my business colleagues, and I also hear it in my conversations with the Commission, is the very narrow approach that the European Union is still taking, as there being just two models out there, and it's either Canada or it's Norway. We know that the Canadian model is totally inappropriate to the UK's needs and the EU's needs. It is so narrow, it doesn't cover financial services meaningfully. It was made for two economies like this and to bring them to here. We're here and it would take us to there. And the Norway model, I think, brings all sorts of challenges in terms of single market membership. And like Catherine, that's not our position. And where we are trying to move the debate is into this idea of a new economic partnership. And actually, I think there's something quite interesting here, that when we talk about free trade agreements, we do trigger a reaction in the European Union that immediately thinks Canada. And when we talk about a partnership, that gets a different result. So I think we have real opportunities here to move the debate. The way that the transition process developed, this time last year, Brussels had ruled it out. I had conversations with Sabine Way on Brussels. It was ruled out and we moved it. Now I think it is to move away from these very narrow models, but it is going to be a challenge.
We have a common position with the ETUC, and we were pleased that through our collective lobbying, the EU guidelines and indeed resolutions to from the European Parliament include that commitment on Monsieur Barnier to seek a level playing field in terms of workers and social rights. I think for our part we're that's positive. We're concerned that Brussels should be as worried about the impact on jobs as we are. For all of us, our fate is intertwined. But I think my sense is that the UK is not always as sensitive as perhaps it needs to be about just what it takes to keep the 27 together, and why they take a rules-based approach, what the politics is, and what scope they have for flexibility, and how much it will be based on precedent. So whether we like it or not, I think we also have to address what those, realistically, what different scenarios are on offer and what that means. And what I'd like from Westminster is a bit more, old-fashioned honesty about what those different scenarios mean for people's jobs and their families and their communities, because we've seen the cabinet advice now, but it seems to me that we need much more transparency and information if we're going to put in place the plans that we will need to protect people as well as we can.
Yes, Larry.
In your perspective, taking both the European side and the British side, how much common ground do you think there is? How much really serious conflict? And what have we not addressed at all? What is missing?
I think there is real common ground, and it is around the protection of jobs and investment. I mean, that is the economic priorities are, I think they are centre stage. That's what got us to the transition agreement, that the cliff edge would have been bad for everybody. So I think that is the common ground, and if we can keep on taking the debate up to the level of prosperity, then I think that is where it's most fruitful to take it. However, the indivisibility of the four freedoms in the single market is a roadblock, and we do need to find a way of achieving those goals. And this is where the red lines are so unhelpful. And I think one of our messages to all sides is let's soften those red lines. Mansion House did soften them. We'd like to see some more softening on the European side to recognise that there is space in the middle. President Macron has recognised that. A bespoke model is a possibility. But the common ground I think we can keep coming back to is shared prosperity and what we have created. And that's, I think, one of the roles that we can play as a business organisation is to keep that centre stage.
And I think in terms of the financial sector, the common ground is that we're all concerned to have well-regulated institutions that don't pose systemic risk that might damage the economy and harm ordinary people in the way that we saw just 10 years ago. And I think that's something on which we should be building for the future. Indeed, it's not just the risks that we faced 10 years ago, but the new and growing risks that there are around, for example, cyber threats or crypto assets and so on. There's a lot of areas here where we could, I think, work constructively together and reminding and addressing those and speaking with the EU on those, I think, is a helpful way into establishing the fact that we do need cooperation on regulation. Takes me back to my mutual access to markets based on mutual recognition of regulatory outcomes. There is a real fear in EU that 27 that we may be tempted to tear up some of the regulation that has been developed over the last 10 years. And this is a fear which people keep expressing to us, even though we keep saying we don't detect from the sector any wish to have a bonfire of regulations or tear up the rule book. Indeed, the Governor of the Bank of France stressed again this morning his concern that there shouldn't be a big change here. So I think that's something on which we can build. What I think we do need to be also looking at is getting across an understanding of how some of the issues we're talking about for the sector do impact on the ordinary person in the street in countries across the EU. And I take as an example there, we mentioned pensions and insurance and so on at the beginning. If we don't if we don't make sure that contracts continue to work, we will find ordinary people will be impacted in their daily lives.
I would agree that the shared commitment that this shouldn't end up in a race to the bottom, you would have thought ought to be a foundation to build on. But my sense is that, well, not just Brussels, I think here working people would quite like some evidence of that, because we've seen amendments to the withdrawal bill that would provide some protection, no regression clauses and so on, rejected. As I said before, I think there would be I guess I would issue a challenge to the government about propose a clause for any deal going forward that provides that cast iron guarantee that workers' rights will keep pace and that this isn't about becoming the offshore cheap labour island.
Thank you. I think, really, as much addressing my colleagues as the witnesses, we will need to quicken our pace a bit because this is being a very fruitful session. I'm not wishing to signal other than that. But we now need to turn a bit to some of the implementation issues and areas in which, in a sense, collectively and in terms of our future report, we may be able to suggest ways of adding value to the government's effort. So I'd like to go straight on, if I can, to Baroness Browning.
Thank you. In your contract with your counterparts in the EU, what would you now describe as the most significant areas of disagreement that exist? And I wonder if you could also tell us, we've heard quite a lot about your contact, which is excellent, but we haven't heard very much about how the UK government have actually involved you in how the UK's approach to future UK-EU relations will develop. And I wonder whether they've approached you, whether you've had to keep hammering on the door. Perhaps you could wind that into that question.
Right. Who'd like to go first?
I'll crack on.
Thanks.
So areas of disagreement. The one that we keep hitting is the idea of we want to stay aligned, but when we want a kind of process of managed divergence over time, particularly the three baskets model that was kind of embedded in the Mansion House speech. That is sounding hugely like cherry picking, and yet there is an appetite for a high alignment model. We need to keep working on that. There is a compromise in there. I'm absolutely convinced of it, but it is a major area of disagreement. The other area, Catherine, I'm sure will speak to, is exactly what relationship we have on financial services. I don't think there is a united view across the EU 27 on that, but again, I think our case that it is in the prosperity of the European Union is served by a strong city is important. So those are two very big areas. The engagement with the government. To be honest, it is. There are a lot of routes in. So I can honestly say that we have a good relationship with BEIS, with Treasury, with the Department for International Trade. What we still feel isn't quite there is a systematic engagement with business on solving these problems and finding the compromise solutions. And just to give you a particular example, just from today, I spent the morning with the Deputy Prime Minister from Belgium. He came with his opposite number, my opposite number from Belgium. They are completely joined up there. They have a business group of 25 business leaders who meet on a monthly basis privately, who are informing the decisions that the government is taking on a regular basis at the highest level. We don't have that. We can create it. It's the right time to do it because we're heading, I think, into the time of really solving these problems that we've touched on today. So it's there, but it's fragmented and it needs to be joined up much more.
I would highlight kind of three areas, key areas of disagreement. One, the dispute settlement mechanism, where clearly the UK has rejected the ECJ. It's an area of big concern for trade unions around trade agreements more generally, so we'll be watching that one very closely. I'd agree with Carolyn, that question of perhaps a sectoral approach versus that being seen as cherry picking is clearly still a bone of contention. And I would say also on Northern Ireland and that issue about whether the European Union's proposal of a backstop of full regulatory alignment and the dismissal of the UK's alternative proposals, smart borders, that certainly from all the evidence I've seen, that, by the way, can take at least 5 years to set up, never mind, even if you take it at face value. So I would highlight those three areas. In terms of our engagement, well, I suppose I would say to the CBI, there's always someone worse off than yourself. It's, shall we say, patchy, and I hope that doesn't reflect the level of priority that's given to our core concerns, which I think are very widespread concerns whichever way people voted in the referendum of jobs and rights and so on. I think the optics on that aren't great, actually, because I don't think that this can be seen as just a Brexit for business. I think this is where we started. That won't look good. I did meet the Brexit Secretary yesterday, and I'm pleased that he agreed to meet the TUC's union leaders. But I would say that's the first time. That will be the first time when that meeting happens since the referendum.
I'll pass that message on when he comes to see us next week. Again, conscious I'm holding you to the fire and my committee too in terms of timing. Lord Sell.
We haven't.
Catherine, very quick.
I'll be very brief. The main message we get back from EU27 is that we have to rely on a standard model and can't ask for a bespoke agreement. We would dispute that because of all the reasons I said earlier. We do see signs of movement, actually, and so, for example, in the minutes of the March Council meeting, it does reflect the idea that that financial services should be included. So we see signs of movement, and we think if we keep working on it, we may see more. In terms of relations with government, that has changed over time. We're absolutely having lots of conversations. The sector has been very joined up, and we're having lots of conversations with government and with individual departments. I agree with Caroline's point, though, that more widely that is fragmented, and I think anything that we can do to help by bringing businesses together, I'm sure we would be happy to do. It does need a slightly more coordinated approach.
I think physically we always have this difficulty. Some of the questions we will come out with have been already alluded to, but reflecting on what you've said, and perhaps, as it were, displacing a couple of my colleagues for this in the interest of time, just to confirm, you as organisations have active discussions with your counterpart organisations within the EU and also with the UK negotiators. I think we need to be clear about that. I mean, relations are continuing, and to some extent, as this becomes more immediate, I would hope intensifying. And then picking up a considerable concern, which will indeed, I think, pave our way into Baroness Faulkner's line of questioning because of her specific subcommittee, the question of financial services, which is mainly for Catherine, but others may want to comment. I mean, the fact that it wasn't in the European Council guidelines, is that sinister? Is it something that we can recover in the final agreement? Where do we go to? I mean, we're trying to get a sense of how the negotiations are evolving, how much you're inputting, and indeed how we can mutually, as it were, reinforce the process of getting a satisfactory outcome.
Yeah. I detect certain disagreement around the table, but my understanding is that the financial services were not covered in the final text of the negotiating guidelines, but that no sector was referenced, and indeed aviation was also removed. But we were pleased to see that the March General Affairs Council minutes did contain a text which recommended that financial services should be included. So we're not reading too much into the fact that it's not specifically referred to in the final negotiating guidelines that have been published. The messages that we do get back from people, as I say, the starting point is that we have to expect a standard model, to which we will keep replying that, first of all, the standard model has been varied, but secondly, that it doesn't work for a sector of this size.
Any other comments on that? Lord Little wants to add in, and it may probably...
I'm very supportive of the city's desire for a bespoke agreement, but I'm not at all clear from what I've read what actually we're asking for. There's a lot of talk about maintaining alignment with the EU in the long run, but us retaining our regulatory autonomy. This seems to me to be contradictory statements. It isn't clear to me whether the aim is to have a cooperative relationship where, are we saying that we want the EU to tell us whatever regulatory changes they're going to make, and if we say we don't like that then they wouldn't go ahead? And vice versa, are we saying that if the EU didn't like what we wanted to do, that we would drop it.
So when you say we, do you mean...
I'm talking about the British government.
The British government.
This as representing the city financial services interest. Yeah.
Indeed, I think that is one area where I would say that it would be helpful to have more clarity around exactly what they are asking. I can tell you precisely what the sector is proposing, which does go into detail. There are a couple of versions around, but what the RSG is proposing does go into detail, not into drafting, but around how this would look as a chapter of a free trade agreement, covering the question of regulatory alignment of regulatory outcomes, setting up a procedure for judging and deciding if there is a divergence, and allowing for a divergence so that you're not cast, we're not shackled to the same regulatory framework forever. Is that what is being asked for? It looks from the speeches and from what we've heard as if what we've proposed is the ask, but we don't have complete detail. No, I agree.
Thank you. I think we go straight on to Baroness Falk now.
Okay, my substantive question. Very quickly, I wanted to pick up a point that Lord Liddell made earlier, particularly to the CBI, and that is this, that you gave an emphatic yes answer to Lord Liddell on the need for low-skilled migration, but I'm also aware of previous documents and stuff the CBI has done, work on the future of work, and the role of the workplace, no longer the RSA's Matthew Taylor's report and so on. How do you reconcile those two statements, that you say emphatically, yes, we need to continue low-skilled migration, yet we recognise that fast approaching is a different kind of model of workplace and a different kind of level of employment in terms of the economy, and particularly low-skilled jobs? A very brief answer, but it seems to me you have a fundamental contradiction that if you want lots of low-skills workers able to come, and then you get, robotics and machine learning and all of that displacing those workers.
And I think that if I just clarify my answer, it was very much about what businesses are telling us at the moment about skill shortages. We have skill shortages that are at their highest level since 1974 at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I'm really relaying to you
low-skilled
across the range.
His question was particularly about low-skilled.
Low-skilled as well. Mm-hmm. So if you talk to our farmers, our food processors, this yogurt company, they are finding it harder to recruit. We have an unemployment rate in the southwest, for example, of 0.8%. So I'm talking about now. Okay. In terms of the future, I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, there's a huge amount of work we're doing about the retraining needs of our economy. Yeah. CBI hugely committed to that. And all our work needs to have absolutely those two considerations in mind: how we train our young people for a workplace of the future, and how we continue to remain open yet controlled in terms of an immigration policy for the future.
Great. Thank you very much. That's dealt with my concern. What model? I wonder whether we've had a lot of this discussion, an hour and 15 minutes or so, looking back at what happened and a lot of where we are. But what do you really think will come out at the end of this? I know it's a bit of a looking into crystal ball. We're all confused. We were just saying earlier before you came in. I don't think confusion is a rare trait at the moment. But what do you think likely outcomes of the negotiations will be on our relationship, the EU and the UK? And what do you think we'll get? First of all, do you think we'll get a trade deal? And what kind of trade deal? What will it look like?
Well, as they say, every day is a new adventure, and it's not always easy to predict. I'm conscious, and it was important from our perspective that Monsieur Barnier left the single market on the table, and that will stay on the table for the transition. We'd encourage the government at least to explore it in some depth, but we probably our best guess will be that we'll end up with some kind of free trade agreement. We then quickly move into the question, how long is all that going to take? So, if CETA is a benchmark, then that was 5-6 years, 7 years before that was signed off. And similarly, as I mentioned before, some of the other proposals around so-called smart borders, even if you take it at face value. Again, we could be talking 5-6 years. How much will it cost? Who will do it? Capita. Some of the other major outsourcers not looking very stable at the moment. So it doesn't, I have to say, look rosy from our perspective, and there are big questions about how well prepared this country is. We've got an industrial strategy. I'm not sure our members are feeling it much at the moment.
Well, I wonder whether you could also add in whether you see any opportunities. I think we've all heard about the drawbacks, but do you see any opportunities coming out of this?
Well,
in the future?
It's difficult when the government's own impact assessment has said we're going to be hit, we're going to lose out, it is going to cost us and cost the economy. So, on a range from 8% drop to a 2% drop, even if we got Norway, there are real consequences for people's jobs and livelihoods. And of course, even if we got the customs union, that doesn't deal with the 80% of the economy in services. And a lot of jobs dependent on trade in services with the EU, and actually relatively little attention in all the discussion about the customs union. I'm a bit worried that we're forgetting about where the bulk of our economy lies and what that means for jobs.
Your colleagues hunting for the upside?
Well, first of all, in predicting the future, I think we have to play the cards in front of us, actually, and that is our job. And we need to bring the business and the evidence voice from our different and the voice of the worker from our different constituencies. One thing I would say, though, I am increasingly worried about a future where actually there is just drift, where there aren't decisions. And I've had a number of members say to me, well, we were very worried about no deal, that hasn't gone away, but now we're worried about no decision. And actually the impact of uncertainty is dramatic. And we are seeing it in our economy. And so the idea that there may be postponement, just kicking the can down the road for months, if not years, I think is something we all need to be avoiding. And there are reasons why that could happen. I mean, upsides are a really interesting question. I think that there is one. And it is this, it's almost the result, the shock to the system that we have had. And I have to say, in conversations with members, the focus on performance and competitiveness and exports, there is a dynamism in our businesses now as a result of this. I don't know where it's going to lead. I cannot forecast the future. I completely agree with Francis that the negative impact assessments kind of accord with where our business members are telling us that they are. But there is something we need to draw on here, and I think that's where the industrial strategy comes in, and we mustn't let that get crowded out by Brexit, and it's something that we are very committed to. So there is the opportunity. It's about the competitiveness of our economy for the future.
I think I see you nodding, Catherine.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. We haven't been able to identify specific opportunities coming out of Brexit, and I've had cross-sectoral meetings where people from other sectors have said the same. But over the last few months, I have detected a new mood of, I think we've been galvanised, a new mood of we get up and do, really. We must examine what our fundamentals are and what best we can do with them. Exactly. And that is perhaps the silver lining. In terms of will we reach an agreement, well, who knows, but I'm very hopeful that if people listen to the economic arguments, then we will reach an agreement and it will be deep and comprehensive, but I think there's a lot to play for yet.
If you could, yes.
Very quickly, we had a rather interesting evidence session last week where an economist from Cambridge came, Dr. Meredith Crowley, and she gave evidence to us, that in fact the future is inevitably going to mean being in trading blocks, and that leaving Europe, and then freewheeling off Europe making, Britain, befriending the world. She said we're going to end up actually having to look at whether it isn't better for us at that stage becoming part of another bloc, and you'd end up with looking at the Pacific, the trade Pacific, the trading bloc in the Pacific, with Australia and New Zealand and so on, in order to head off China, or in fact the Mexican Canadian thing with the United States. That you end up because. The future is in being in a bloc. The nature of the globalised world is going on your own when you're a wee place like the UK is not going to work for us in the big, wide world. What do you make of that?
I have to say we would agree with a lot of that. I mean, the economics of it are very compelling, that bilateral trade deals are less advantageous than multilateral trade deals. And our members say the same thing, actually. The power of being part of a bloc and going to negotiate, for example, in India or in China, is more powerful. So there is something in that. But then I think we need to look at the arithmetic.
It's
here.
like collective bargaining, I'm sure Miss O'Grady would say.
But then let's just look at the numbers there, because the total TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, accounts for 8% of our trade now. If we join that, we are joining, a smaller club than we're part of now. So these numbers really matter, and I have to say I would agree with that analysis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Francis, you've got to comment on that?
Just to add, of course, we're in a global economy. You combine to boost your bargaining power. This was part of the TUC's assessment in looking at where our best options lie. The question for us is that the single market, the EU single market, is the only bloc that provides a voice for working people and a level of protection for working people that we think is worth having. No other bloc does that. That's the difference. We're going to have to play by somebody's rules. It's just whose rules.
Yeah. Thank you. Baroness Neville-Rolfe.
Just on that, I think myself that just because blocs are powerful, it doesn't mean to say that you want to be in a customs union without having other aspects of the EU, because my worry is you become a rule taker. You're not part of the negotiation in the Trade Council, which I've been involved in the past. So the Germans and the French are deciding what the trade remit is going to be in future trading agreements. So you do have a problem if you're in the customs union only. And that's why I wanted to move on to my question, which is about what areas we expect to be covered in the framework that's going to be agreed, as we all hope, in October 2018. And perhaps I could cross-reference the guidelines produced by the Council, which actually I took some hope from, I have to say, particularly Section 8, which lists various areas where they think there might be a future relationship. Things like zero tariffs, yes, and, stuff on services. And, of course, there was improved equivalence in financial services was in there, but got taken out for the reasons we've already heard. And I wanted to ask you, if you look forward to October, what you think sort of reasonable prospective conclusion might be on the framework.
The short answer would be not a lot, not least because the EU has been clear that there won't be detailed negotiations until the UK becomes a third country. So I think there won't be much in it. I think the political declaration might be more substantial, but again, we mustn't forget that of course is not binding. It is just what it says, a political declaration. I'm sure there'll be a lot of fire and fury around that, but it doesn't tie anybody's hands.
I think I would hope, I think I took comfort as well from the guidelines. I wonder whether we could also be hoping for some issues that are absolutely patently in our mutual interest to be ticked off. I mean, there are some aviation. Absolutely nobody wants to threaten air safety. And could we tick that off? Could we tick off actually pharmaceuticals so that drugs can get to patients? So I think that would be one thing that we will be trying to work towards. I do think that if we can get off the language of free trade agreement onto the area of whether it's association agreement, which is the European Parliament language, I know there are challenges with that, but I think if we can between now and October have moved to a place where we're talking partnership rather than a Canadian variant, I think that would be very helpful.
And we obviously would hope to see financial services. The fact that financial services will be covered in the final agreement referred to in October. And I think Francis is right. We can't expect as much clarity or detail as we would like, but we would certainly want to see that.
I mean, the only thing I should add is that if we don't get progress on Northern Ireland by October, then we could be back to no deal.
Well, of course, it is an explicit part of the withdrawal agreement in some sense to provide that. I think we then, owing to huge self-discipline, without any diminution of quality, if I may say, we are coming towards our final line of questioning. If we can just conclude in the last 10 minutes on that, the evidence session, which is really looking at the issues that may not be resolvable by October and the withdrawal agreement plus the political statement annexed, and therefore, but are issues that will remain to be resolved thereafter. I can perhaps ask Baroness Armstrong to start on that.
What do you think those issues will be that will need to be resolved after we technically leave?
So during the transition period?
Yeah.
I think there'll be a huge number of issues, but I think we'll be very concerned to see that contract continuity issues and the question of data flows are tackled as quickly as possible. That's going to need to be resolved. And then I think the relationship we can forge on regulatory frameworks going forward from our perspective will need to be addressed.
Carolyn?
If you're a business at the moment, you are taking an incredibly practical lens on this, and you have three questions. What will the rules be governing my European trade? Yeah. Will there be tariffs and border checks? And can I employ the people I need? Those will be the three questions. It's going to be incredibly practical. There are 19,000 European directives that govern our trade at the moment. All of them are going to have to be answered during that transition period. And we are going to need to have complete clarity about the customs process over time. That will beg the question of the length of the time that will take, which I think will come up very quickly on us, actually, after we have left.
I think it's going to be phenomenal.
Francis.
I think it is, as I said, the vast bulk of the work will have to be done at that point, and that's the scope, the dispute mechanism, the enforcement. I have to say, in terms, again, as a realist, I think it looks like mission impossible to get that sorted within the transition, mission impossible without Tom Cruise.
Thank you.
Can
I'm sorry, Hilary, yes, please.
You mentioned, Carolyn, that that actually business doesn't want to be in a position where they're not clear about the future. But on the other hand, 20 months to sort all these things out is a very short period. Have you any evidence, any feel that the government is looking and working with either unions or businesses about the practical means of sorting some of these things?
This is exactly the kind of area where we need to get that partnership up and running on a regular sort of structured basis. Because I've had conversations, but they are sporadic.
You know, we keep being told about smart borders,
exactly.
But actually,
exactly,
as far as I can see, there's no clear work going on that.
No, and just to add, for example, in terms of planning for the worst, which should happen, whether we want it to or not, our unions aren't aware of a single planning application that's gone into a single port around the UK. I mean, it's worrying, and I would have thought that all of us would be happy, maybe not in separate rooms, but let's get in a room together and try and focus on some of these practical issues and resolving problems.
Yes. For example, there's been an offer from the lawyers where there is a Brexit law committee that's been set up under the auspices of the MOJ. There's been an offer from the lawyers to help with some of the statutory instrument review that's going to be necessary with all the statutory instruments that will have to come in under the withdrawal bill. Taking advantage of that sort of offer from business and the professional services, I think, will be very important because there is so much work that has to be done.
That's very helpful.
Well, we've made it face-to-face, actually, in the Brexit Law Committee, and the MOJ, I think, are looking at that. I hope
Okay, we've got Secretary of State coming next week, so we can sort of, for DEXU, so we can round it up. Lord Selko.
Lord Chairman, can I ask a question about inward investment? In the past, British governments encouraged inward investment in a country, for example, like Japan, deliberately invested in different parts of the United Kingdom on the grounds that that will give them a foothold for expanding their markets in Europe. Now, I imagine that kind of trading arrangement will contract, but other trading adaptations will no doubt come on the agenda. Is there sufficient scope for the transitional arrangements to take account of that so that necessary changes can be made?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, there is no doubt that our major inward investors are deeply concerned. The Japanese have spoken out very vocally, and we should believe them. I mean, they left Wales in force in the 1990s as a result of changes in policy. They move strategically and over the long term. In terms of our economy adapting, I mean, one of the things I'm very struck by is businesses are hugely adaptable, and China is very interested in investing in the UK, for example, but it will take time. And I think this is, again, going back to the kind of question that we can be examining together in a spirit of partnership around how we ensure that we've got enough time, because Japanese firms employ 190,000 people in this country. The impact on jobs is potentially very, very significant.
I think we have to expect that the pattern of investment will change. We have, for example, taking China as an instance, we have a lot of financial institutions, over 30 now in the City of London, from China. We also have a lot of investment in the fabric of the city, where a number of our buildings have been bought by Chinese investors. There's no sign of that investment slowing down in buildings and assets. But when I go and speak to the head offices of the institutions that we've got about their future plans, they are where they might have been thinking of putting their European base for business in London. They're reconsidering that for obvious reasons, because until we know what the long-term future is, why invest in something which may not give you the access that you want?
Francis.
If you take something like the car industry, Nissan, but the car industry more generally, I would say Brexit isn't the only factor. We know there are lots of other pressures on the car industry, not least squeezed disposable income in the UK. But it is a big factor. And, we're very conscious and keeping our ears very close to the ground through our conveners about investment decisions that are being taken, because, yes, we may see one kind of investment replaced by another, but our question is always, what kind of jobs is that going to create, and where? Is it going to be in the parts of the country that need them, and how do we manage that transition? What we don't want to see is good jobs replaced by low-paid, insecure ones.
Thank you. We've actually got one sort of counterpart question left to put, so I'm going to ask Lord Woolmer and Baroness Kennedy perhaps to put their respective parts of it together for your consideration, because it does rather fit together, I think.
You said that getting agreement by December 2020 is challenging. I think fair description. Assuming that the full detailed agreements were all hammered out by December 2020, would industry, business and government services be in a position to implement that agreed set of relationships by 2020? In other words, putting aside the government's use or misuse of the phrase, the transition period isn't actually an implementation period. That will come after implementation. So do you think an implementation period, if the transition leads to an agreement in detail, not headlines, do you think an implementation period is highly likely to be needed?
Can I perhaps, because we're trying to round up now, sort of gloss on that also, be helpful in your response if you can say a bit about the moment when the UK becomes a third country after we've left, irrespective of the transition implementation period, and the dynamic of the negotiations when, as I think one of our Norwegian interlocutors said to us, we become a lobbyist rather than a member. And perhaps, Baroness Kennedy, if you'd like to wrap up on the specific industrial question, which I think is relevant to this.
I was interested, Carolyn Fairbairn, that you mentioned that there are these equivalent organisations to the CBI in other parts of Europe and that you have close contact with them. And I just wondered, I mean, will our withdrawal from the European Union affect your ability to liaise and to work with your equivalent organisations in the EU? And that must be, it's a question also for you, Francis O'Grady, about, you know, how we've often, and I say this as a lawyer, we've often been able to influence lots of things. You know, people, if you were to watch the tabloid press, you'd think that all the law came rushing at us from Europe. We've been very interactive and actually played a huge role in the development of law across Europe. And so I just wanted to know, I mean, to what extent will those relationships be possible? I mean, for example, with the European Labour Agency, you know, how will we be able to maintain that same proximity, or will we no longer be in the club and therefore it will affect the relationships?
Shall I start there?
Final wrap-up answers from each of you.
From each of you. Shall I just start there? Business Europe includes non-European members. Technically, I mean, we will still be a member. We will still absolutely try and influence. Turkey is a member, for example. But I do think it leads back to this point. We want to be members of agencies. I think the more that we can create the connection. And our Business Europe colleagues say, we have hugely valued your input. We hear that from agencies across the European Union, our technical experience, our commitment to markets, all of that. So we will be there around that table. But the more that we can create the other networks, the better. I just want to say, I'll just say finally, on the real implementation phase following a transition, I think it is very likely that we will need something of that kind. It may not be the same for every sector, and it's one of the questions that we are going to be asking our members.
Thank you. Francis?
I mean, I would agree. I would say if good progress had been made, and there was, you know, a good spirit of cooperation, I could see some flexibility on that point. But it's a very, very important point that doing the deal is one half of the equation. The other half is actually businesses and people having the chance to implement them. I think a very good question about how will the dynamic change after the 30th of March. Again, my own personal view is that Monsieur Barnier has been very canny in agreeing that the UK can pursue and indeed sign deals with other countries, because I think it will be very interesting to see during that period how many deals we have signed and who with to deliver how much trade and how many jobs in the UK. And I suspect that will have a big impact on our bargaining power with the EU in terms of that future relationship. Do we look like we're in a strong position, or is it a case of beggars can't be choosers? And then finally, as I've said to my friends in the ETUC, there will be no Toxit. We will continue as members of the ETUC, and ironically, we will still, therefore, through the ETUC, be able to influence EU legislation.
Thank you. Catherine.
Very quickly from me. Big business will have made the arrangements it needs to make in order to serve its customers on day one post-Brexit. What that means, how serious that is for us in terms of jobs, will depend on how much progress we've made and how much clarity we've given. And I don't think we can take what happens on day one as an indication of what will happen over the next 5, 10, years or so. I think we really need to watch that. In terms of loose ends and how long this is going to take, I think it's going to take a very, very long time to tie up all the loose ends. Speaking just as a contract lawyer, and some of the previous implementation periods I've seen necessary for just single regulations, it's going to take a long time. I think the bottom line is that we all need to be pragmatic rather than dogmatic, actually, and we need to try to find a sensible way through this that works for everybody, but most particularly works for ordinary people who are impacted by the services which our sectors provide.
In concluding the evidence session, can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you most warmly. I think one senses around the committee a very warm approbation for the comprehensiveness and the insights that you've given us in your answers. And if I may say also for the complementarity of it. I don't think anyone came out looking for difficulties between you, but I think they will not have found them. It's very useful to have that concerted view, and we will, of course, in our normal way, send you a transcript for correction of any factual issues. But I also hope you will feel this is a living relationship, and you can come back to us in whatever way is most convenient and flexible as this rather interesting and difficult time matures, and we have to keep on with it. We will continue to address it, and I know you will, and indeed we wish you every luck in your doing so. So if I may then formally thank you. What we'll now do is conclude the formal evidence session. If the committee will bear with me a minute, I'll go and thank the witnesses personally, and then we'll reconvene for as short a reasonable time as we can, because we've got one or two bits of committee business to conclude. But thank you very much.